All right, folks, I'm going to get started. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to the second week of class. So we're done with the first week, so that's a good thing. Now we're starting on our path to the first exam. Not here yet, a few weeks away, but material has been covered. We're going to cover more material today, so things are starting to get serious. I hope you are plugged in. You're plugged into this experience overall. The semester, you're plugged into this course. You're not going to unplug. You're not going to detach yourself. You're going to keep on top of what you need to do, so you're not going to fall behind. You're going to use all your time to learn as much as possible the stuff we cover in this course as well as your other courses. You're going to, ideally take some extra time to enjoy your lives as well, but that is not the priority right now. The priority is school. So if you're in school, that's what you're doing. You are a student. That is your priority. That is who you are. Your work is secondary to that. If you have a job, and your private life is also secondary or tertiary to that. So just keep that in mind. This is what you do. This is who you are. If this is the case, then things will work out for you. If it is not the case, you need to change and adapt a bit. As far as the people trying to get in, is there anybody here that has not attended at all last week and trying to get into the course? Okay, good. For those of you that are still trying to get into the course, like I said last week, you need to continue coming to demonstrate that you are dedicated to trying to be in the course, but as I've already said, that may not result in anything, or it may result in something. Who knows? It depends on whether or not people drop out or not. But in order to be in the running, you have to keep coming to class. You have to keep being here the entire class period and then signing in at the end of the class period. If you don't do that, you're out of the running. In the end, it's all up to me to decide who gets into the course. So this is my system. If you're not following it, you're out. I've been checking the enrollment, and as of yesterday, and as of this morning, actually, there are no open slots. So I'll keep checking enrollment. As slots pop up, I will email people and give them the permission numbers. I've ordered you as based on the order that you had on the waiting list. So that's the order of priority for me, and that's the order I will honor. So if you're low on that list, I mean, the chances are slim. You're free to keep trying, but again, like, it's all about availability. Are there any questions about that? Yeah. Okay, don't worry about that. Everything will be clear on Connect. And so as we finish chapters, I'll open up the homeworks and the deadlines will be clear. You know, when I'm going through the schedule and I'm like retyping things up from a prior syllabus, maybe things get missed, but don't worry about it. Are there any other questions that you'd like me to address about the course, about anything in general? Yeah.
From the first homework, I had a couple questions about calculations.
Okay, did you watch my videos?
Yeah, I did.
And there were still questions?
Yeah.
Okay, so ask them on Piazza,
Okay.
and then I'll address them there.
All
All right, and just a brief note about the crazy stuff going on in this country with respect to the whole world. Just know that the university is behind you if you are Muslim. Obviously, there are issues with respect to the way Muslim folks are being approached with respect to this administration. It's complicated. It's ugly. It might get worse. Who knows? But don't let the situation get to you. Just focus on the fact that there are a lot of people that support you and respect you, and you see it. You saw it out in the streets. You saw it out in the airports. You saw it worldwide. Not everybody behaves and thinks the way our administration currently is behaving and thinking. So, and if you're experiencing any kind of like distress because of the situation, there's counseling services on campus. You can come talk to me. You can go talk to your other professors, whatever. Like, don't let things bottle up. Like, make sure you talk to people about it. Make sure you work out your feelings because feelings are there and they need to be worked out. And if you don't, they can become a problem. So keep that in mind. All right, now back to the business at hand. So today we're going to start covering Chapter 2, and we'll finish covering Chapter 2 on Thursday. Chapter 2 is going to cover your standard supply and demand model, something you covered a couple of times ideally by this point. Lightly maybe covered it in your high school course, and of course a little bit more intensely in your introductory micro course. But of course here we're going to go a little bit further. We're going to introduce a little bit of the math that underlies the graphical relationships and just talk a little bit more about the complexity of this model and ultimately provide some insights into how managers can best maneuver markets where this kind of model applies. So this model is for a competitive market setting, often called the perfectly competitive market setting, in which a market is as competitive as possible. And so the competitive forces of the market are doing the best they can as far as like resulting in the best outcome of a market. Generally, a market like that will be characterized by a lot of sellers that don't really have any leverage, like they can't price any differently than their competitors or they get priced out of the market. A lot of buyers, there's just a bunch of folks trying to buy the same goods, so the consumer competitive dimension is there in its highest extent possible, and the good that's being sold is generic, something very general like wheat or oil or like steel, things that nobody can really take and say, this is my version of this, because, you know, your wheat and my wheat are the same. Like your cotton and my cotton are the same. So that's what this model is sort of meant to elucidate, is like characteristics of that kind of market. And it is one of the sort of like the extreme ends of like what a competitive spectrum might look like as far as what a firm can potentially operate in. The other one is a monopoly where there's only one seller and there's no competition at all. We'll cover that case later. We won't talk too much about that, the whole competitive nature of this market. We're going to talk more about the mechanics of it in this chapter. And then later when we get into, after the first exam, when we start talking about like how firms operate in different market settings, we'll highlight the nature of this market a little bit more. I just wanted to kind of drop a few of those seeds in now before I get too far into the chapter. So of course there's demand. So we'll talk about the demand side and just the various issues related to that. What is demand? What is the law that governs it? What are the things that affect demand? Same thing for supply. So we'll talk about the issues again, and then we'll cut it off there, and then we'll talk about the market equilibrium, and then how things might distort that equilibrium in the next meeting, and then that'll end chapter 2. So just don't worry too much about the I wanted to mention the homeworks and the mini papers. I think I mentioned this last week, but in case I didn't, the due dates will not be until the middle of the third week for everything up until the middle of the third week due to like ads and drops and whatnot. So don't worry too much about like the severity of getting things done as soon as possible as far as like those due dates go, but you should worry about it as far as like keeping on top of things and making sure you're learning stuff. I like hearing that people are already doing the homework. That's a good thing. You should be covering this stuff as soon as we cover it. The best approach is always to take a good amount of notes in class, and then go over your notes again, either with the book or with the lecture, to fill in the gaps, the things that maybe you weren't clear on in class or didn't take complete notes on, and then transcribe those into like, so if you're covering one chapter, you transcribe most of the concepts from the chapter onto like one page, like front and back, write small, and you have most of the stuff on there. So then that's your study guide for chapter 1 for the midterm. So then by the time the midterm comes around, you have study guides ready, and you're just ready to kind of roll through them as many times as you need to really get the stuff down. And then of course, practicing the calculations and stuff is also something you should be doing, things that are covered both in demonstration problems in class and in homework problems. All right, let's get into the chapter. All right, so learning objectives for the chapter: explain the laws of demand and supply and identify factors that cause demand and supply to shift. Pretty standard ideas. that are common in most second chapters of courses like this. Calculate consumer surplus and producer surplus and describe what they mean. So when we say that the market is doing the best it possibly can, we say that consumer and producer surplus are at their maximum, and consumer and producer surplus are the benefit that consumers and producers gain from a market. And we'll talk about more what that looks like and how we can calculate it when we get to those sections. Explain price determination in a competitive market and show how equilibrium changes in response to changes in determinants of demand and supply. So once we get down the things that do affect demand and supply, and once we get them together into the equilibrium and establish like what an equilibrium is and why the market is always kind of heading to that equilibrium, we'll talk about what happens to that equilibrium when demand and supply shift. And so it differs based on whether just one is shifting or both. And that's something to be conscious of, and we'll cover it. Explain and illustrate how excise taxes, ad valorem taxes, price floors, and price ceilings impact the functioning of a market. So again, we're going to establish the basic market, the demand and supply forces, what the equilibrium is that results from their interaction, and then we'll talk about how things affect that equilibrium, right? So I talked about how shifts might affect it, but also if you introduce taxes into the system, that will shift curves, and we'll talk about that. So you might have excise taxes, which are per unit taxes that are the same, versus ad valorem taxes, which are taxes that are based on the value. So it's a percentage tax versus then a flat per unit tax. I will talk about more about that when we get to it. Price floors and price ceilings as well. When you try to sort of stop the market from getting to that equilibrium price, either from below or from above, we'll talk about how that affects the market, and we'll calculate the effects of that. We'll apply demand and supply and demand analysis as a qualitative forecasting tool to see the big picture in competitive markets. So this term qualitative is important because it highlights the nature of our analysis in this chapter, and it is in contrast to a quantitative analysis. So here we're just saying, oh yeah, the demand supply, they establish an equilibrium, and changes in the market will maybe increase price by a certain amount and decrease quantity by a certain amount. We won't necessarily say exactly how much. We don't need to. It's just about describing the quality of those effects. So qualitative versus quantitative, where you have actual numbers that can represent the relationship between, price and quantity demanded, price and quantity supplied in a market, and then, doing a statistical analysis of your market, you can actually get to solid numbers about what's happening in a particular market setting. So that's the qualitative approach, which is what we take in chapter 3. So we'll talk a little bit about the qualitative demand analysis in that chapter, and then we'll talk about some of the statistical tools that we use to analyze markets qualitatively. We won't get too far into it. We'll talk a little bit about it. I believe most of you took a statistics course, so you've been introduced to these concepts to some extent. But we'll lightly touch upon them here, and I will expect you to know some of the statistical properties that are necessary to understand that kind of approach. But that's chapter 3. All right, so let's talk about demand. So suppose a clothing manufacturer desires information about the impact of its pricing decisions on the demand for its jeans in a small foreign market. So to obtain the information, it might engage in market research, right? Market research can entail like doing consumer surveys or doing producer surveys, surveying producers about what their prices are that they're charging and maybe how much they're selling at different prices in different areas. So again, the firm might engage in market research to determine how many pairs of jeans consumers would purchase each year at alternative prices per unit. So you might generate this kind of table where, again, you have the information here regarding the price of jeans. So as the price of jean increases, we see the quantity of jeans sold decreases. Pretty standard sort of relationship between quantity demanded and price. And then we see that the average consumer income here is constant. The advertising expenditure is constant here. And the average price of shirts, a related good, is also constant. So the market research reveals that holding all other things constant, so holding all these other things constant, the quantity of jeans consumers are willing and able to purchase goes down as price rises. So you may already know this as this fundamental economic principle known as the law of demand, just like this inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. As price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. As price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. So yeah, they are inversely related. That's another way of describing that. All right, so that kind of relationship can be captured via a market demand curve, a curve you've seen before. For a market demand curve, we're always going to have price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second because ultimately quantity demanded responds to price. And the way we graph it, it seems as though the opposite is the case, where price responds to quantity demanded. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but let me just define the market demand curve formally as the book does. It's a curve indicating the total quantity of a good all consumers are willing and able to purchase at each possible price, holding the prices of related goods, income, advertising, and other variables constant. So essentially like the law of demand embodied in a curve. The line is downward sloping, reflecting the law of demand. So the fact that the price and quantity variables have this inverse relationship is captured by the negative slope, right? So as you move from zero quantity demanded to a greater amount, we see that the curve goes down, right? So that again embodies the law of demand. Also, other factors that influence demand are held constant at each point on the line. So it's acknowledged very, very explicitly in this field and all fields related to business that look at demand that there's more factors that affect quantity demanded than just the price of a good, right? But that's the nature of the world. The world is complicated and several variables act upon the variables that we're interested in studying. But we need to be able to simplify the world via a model like this and say, well, these other things are being held constant in order to try to understand the relationship between the most relevant variables. So also to represent something graphically, graphs are relationships between two variables. And if you were to try to graph the relationship between more than two variables, you could do a three-dimensional graph, which maybe includes the effect of income or like the price of related goods on it. But there would be a third axis, the z-axis, that would come out from the flat plane. We have xy here, xy, and the z would come out, and then you could kind of represent it. A three-dimensional relationship as actually what it'll wind up looking at geometrically, graphically, is just like a three-dimensional shape. And that shape will have meaning as far as like the relationship of the variables, but it's a little bit more difficult to interpret. Then you could go one step further and toss in time. So that could be the fourth variable that you could look at in relation to these things. How are these variables changing over time? So then you would have a three-dimensional construct, and then maybe it would be animated, and you would say, well, in period 1 through 100, this is how this relationship is changing over time. And then that shape might change a bit. But beyond that fourth dimension, like you can't represent a relationship anymore. That's more complicated than that. And that's why you will often see like more complicated relationships being simplified in some way, shape, or form into simple, two-dimensional relationships, in part because of our limitations in our ability to just represent these things geometrically, which is the best way to sort of gain an intuition about how those relationships work. Seeing something on a graph, it's easy to identify like how the two variables are related and like how things might change in relation to other things changing. And so it's useful, but again, we do acknowledge in economics that our models sometimes are unrealistic as far as like the assumptions we make to simplify them to be able to then explain certain things. But ultimately, if we're using these models, there's a consensus that they are effective. And so even though you might have simplifying assumptions that seem unrealistic, the results wind up correlating with reality, and thus the simplifying assumptions have come to be accepted as, like, something that we're all willing to sort of just be tolerant of. So for those of you that might have criticisms of the simplicity of the approach taken in this class, that's sort of like the standard response to that via the economic discipline and other disciplines that use similar methods. All right, so market demand curve. So it's important to understand how to describe differences in movements along the curve versus shifts of the entire curve. So when we're talking about a movement along the curve, because only one thing is changing, price is the only thing affecting quantity demanded, and the curve is a relationship between price and quantity demanded, then we say that we have a change in quantity demanded. So changes in the price of a good lead to a change in the quantity demanded of that good. This corresponds to a movement along a given demand curve. But of course, sometimes the entire relationship between price and quantity will change because some other variable is affecting it. And so, again, given that we are working within this two-dimensional limited sort of representation of this relationship, the best way to demonstrate the effect of other variables is to shift the entire relationship. So again, economists recognize that variables other than the price of a good influence demand. When we graph the demand curve for good X, we hold everything but the price of X constant. So like you saw on that table, the price of advertising was held constant, the price of related goods was held constant, income was held constant. But let's say one of those things changes, then that's when we say we have a change in demand. So if something other than the price of the good is changing, we say we have a change in demand versus a change in quantity demand, which results only from a change in the price. So changes in demand are changes in variables other than the price of a good, such as income or the price of another good, that lead to a change in demand. This corresponds to a shift of the entire demand curve. So if there's a decrease in demand, the curve will shift to the left, and if there's an increase in demand, the curve will shift to the right. So again, the distinction is important. So a change in demand, again, reflects the fact that, let's say initially at $1, there were 10 jeans that were demanded. And because there's a change in demand at $1 now, in this case, there's an increase in demand. At $1, folks are willing to buy 15 rather than 10 jeans, and that happens at every single price. At every single price, people are willing to buy more. So at any given price, our quantity demand has increased. Therefore, the demand overall has increased. Versus a change in quantity demanded. A change in quantity demanded simply reflects the fact that, let's say at $1, folks are willing to buy 10 jeans. If the price were to be reduced to 50 cents, then folks obviously would demand more, and so the quantity demanded in that case has increased. All right, so predominantly 5 factors affect demand. I'll just list them here and then I'll go through them in turn. So consumer income is one, obviously. Prices of related goods, also. Advertising and consumer tastes, population, and consumer expectations. So even though there are other variables that can affect demand, these are the main ones, but we do acknowledge there are other ones, and they can be examined as well. But these are the dominant ones. All right, so the first one obviously is income. How much income folks have affects how much they're willing to buy of a particular good. If you've taken, well, you have taken macro, you know that there's such a thing called disposable income, and that's the amount of income that a household makes minus taxes plus transfer payments, which are payments directly from the government. We don't go into specifics about that in this class, so we're talking about income. Let's just leave it at just your general idea of what income is. We're not going to be specific about what type of income we're talking about here. It's more of a macro concern. So whether an increase in income shifts the demand curve to the right or the left depends on the nature of consumer consumption patterns, right? So all the time when income goes up, it doesn't mean that people are going to buy more of everything, because there's certain things that they would buy less of if they have more income, right? So a normal good is a good for which an increase in income leads to an increase in the demand for a good, and vice versa. So it's just the normal things that people sort of covet when they don't have a lot of money, things that are more expensive that they want to buy but they can't buy, and so like luxury cars. More luxury cars are purchased when income goes up. It's a normal good generally. Just like name brand things, higher quality goods versus like generic brand goods. And that's in contrast to the case of an inferior good, right? An inferior good is a good for which an increase in income leads to a decrease in the demand for the good, and vice versa. So you're in college right now, your incomes are fixed, you don't have a lot of money, you're willing to buy like generic brand hot dogs, not something you want to buy, but sometimes you might be, just in that situation where you only have enough money to buy some generic brand hot dogs to get you through the next couple of days as far as the food goes. Hey, you got to do what you got to do to survive while you're in college. It's what we all have done. It's what history has shown us we have to do to survive in order to grow and advance in society. As you get out of college and you start earning money, you're not going to want to buy generic brand hot dogs anymore. You're going to want to buy those good all beef hot dogs, have that stamp of approval from like some free range, farm where they treat the animals good, and there's no weird chemicals being injected into the animal's food, that kind of thing, right? So that kind of thing costs more, right? Because it costs more to like produce that kind of quality. As your incomes go up, you buy less of the generic brand hot dogs. It is an inferior good, and you buy more of the, all beef, whatever hot dogs, and those are normal goods for you. Yes. Of course.
For one person, maybe the generic brand hot dog is if I make more money, I can buy more.
Yeah. So yeah, ultimately it is subjective. It depends on your own taste, but in general, generally we talk about general cases here, but there's always exceptions to like the general rules, right? So yeah, that's always acknowledged, and I will always acknowledge that. But again, in general, people will buy less generic brand hot dogs as they make more money. Let's face it. All right. Prices of related goods, something else that will shift demand. So changes in the price of related goods generally shift the demand curve for a good. There are typically two types of related goods to any type of good we're considering. One is substitutes. So goods for which an increase in the price of a good leads to an increase in the demand for the other goods. So let's say we're talking about explicitly actual like sugar substitutes, let's say. You're a Sweet and Low person. All of a sudden, Sweet and Low is like, we're going to double prices. People love our stuff. They're going to still buy our stuff. Well, obviously, whoever made that terrible decision didn't realize that there are, some very clear substitutes to this sugar substitute, Equal and Splenda. So, the price of Sweet and Low goes up. People substitute away from Sweet and Low to Equal and Splenda because their prices are, relatively less now. So that's one type of related good, a substitute good versus a complement, right? Goods for which an increase in the price of one good leads to a decrease in the demand for the other good, and vice versa. So peanut butter and jelly is your classic example. Peanut butter and jelly are bought together generally, but if the price of jelly goes up, people will buy less jelly, law of demand, but they'll also buy less peanut butter because they tend to buy them together. They're complements. Is this the case for everybody? No, but it's generally the case in the United States, at least, given the taste of this country and our culture. All right, third main shifter of demand is consumer taste, which can be driven by advertising. So let's say we're talking about high style clothing. Again, here's a demand curve representing that relationship. We held that variable constant when we draw the demand curve, but also on that table we looked at earlier. But let's say there's an increase in advertising. There's a lot more money spent on advertising. The advertising is clever. It's really changed your idea about the value of wearing jeans and how much that carries in society and how much that can enhance your value. So at any given price, you're willing to buy more jeans. So that increases demand, which would shift demand to the right. So let's say for 50,000 units, you can look at this two different ways. One is by looking at the amount being purchased at any given price. If demand increases, then that means that that same amount people are willing to pay more for it. So for 50,000, let's say jeans, before they were willing to pay 40, now they're willing to pay $50. And the other way to look at it is that at any given price, people are willing to buy more. So at $40, they were willing to buy 50,000, but now they're willing to buy 60,000. However you choose to look at it, in the end, it's an increase in demand due to advertising. There's two types of advertising. There's informative, yes. So that'll decrease demand, right? So if the advertising campaign turns people off from the good, then at any given price, people will buy less, and demand will shift to the left, right? Do you get that? All right, so two types of advertising generally. There's informative advertising. So advertising often provides consumers with information about the existence or quality of a product, which in turn induces more consumers to buy the product. So that's informative advertising versus persuasive advertising. Advertising can influence demand by altering underlying tastes of consumers. So informative, again, information versus persuasive, trying to sort of affect your taste by just kind of creating arguments that might change your mind about the way you feel about something versus just informing you about, the value it holds. All right, the fourth factor that can affect demand is population. So the demand for a product is also influenced by changes in the size and composition of population. Generally, as populations rise, more and more individuals wish to buy a given product, and this has the effect of shifting the demand curve to the right and vice versa. So just a good example is kind of like the baby booms generation that occurred post World War II. A lot of all the vets came back. A lot of people finally were able to get reunited, but we lost millions of folks in that war, and so people were like, "Oh, let's make some more people." So they made a lot more people, right? And then the baby boom happened, and then that generation sort of moved its way through time. At any given point, like, maybe for baby products, demand increased because there were a lot more babies. So at any given price, baby formula was being purchased more. When they got to college, same thing. A good percentage of those folks went to college. So at any given price, more college was demanded. So the demand curve for college increased, and so on and so forth. Now these folks are going to be retiring, and demand for medical services, demand for different types of prescription drugs, etc., will increase as a result of that population growing, right, in those markets. But population itself is not responsible for overall growth of the economy, but does affect the growth of individual markets if the market is relevant to the population. All right, and finally, consumer expectations, which is one variable that really complicates economic analysis in general, and will complicate all of your experiences within the business world. It reflects the fact that we have these what are called animal spirits inside of us. It's what John Maynard Keynes termed. John Maynard Keynes is like the economist that developed macroeconomics in the 30s. He basically said, no matter what we think will happen, we ultimately cannot depend on that happening because of our animal spirits, the animal side of us that will sometimes act counteractive to what is logical, right? And so it makes economic analysis difficult because we never really understand the way things are actually going to go. So although we can take as many variables as possible into consideration and say, yeah, we think the markets are going to behave in this fashion, in the end, we don't actually know. So you might have a situation where people expect things to go badly, even though there aren't any clear signs of it. And because of that, they'll start pulling back from their spending, and then that will actually cause the economy to start contracting. It's called the paradox of thrift. But anyway, consumer expectations are one of those variables that kind of leads our discipline to wind up being an art versus a science, ultimately, as far as how it's categorized. Because, again, we can't completely predict how people are going to behave, but consumer expectations do affect markets, and so changes in consumer expectations also can change the position of the demand curve for a product. So if folks think that the price of the good, let's say they do get a sign that, like, let's say oil, we're talking about oil. Let's say that all of a sudden there's a war in the Middle East, like full-blown war amongst all the states, like there was when Israel established themselves as a state, and then all the other countries kind of attacked them, and that resulted in a lot of the oil kind of drying up because the countries weren't willing to export to countries that supported Israel. During those, because that, like, right when you get like news like that, as a consumer you might say, well, I know the price of oil is going to go up next year, so I better buy a bunch of oil today. So like there might be a bunch of people stockpiling oil or whatever, so at any given price they'll buy more oil if they think the price is going to go up. If they think the price is going to go down, there's this whole new supply of oil that was discovered, under, Nevada or something. I don't know, and that's been reported in the news. People know there's going to be a greater supply of oil in the future. That means prices will go down. That means in the present, I won't buy as much oil because I know oil is going to go down in about 6 months. So consumer expectations play a big role in markets, and ultimately in their effect on demand and also on supply. We'll talk about that when we get to supply. All right, so that's like your general stuff about demand that you've already learned at some point in your lives. So now let's talk about the demand function, right? The mathematical relationship between quantity demanded and price. So the demand function is a function that describes how much of a good will be purchased at alternative prices of that good and related goods, alternative income levels, and alternative values of other variables affecting demand. So let's use a little notation here to represent our variables. Let's let Q superscript D subscript X represent the quantity demanded of good X. So that's what this variable represents. Let's let P subscript X represent the price of good X. We'll let P subscript Y represent the price of a related good. So you have to keep track of notation whenever you're dealing with a lot of variables, because like you see here, you have two price variables, and the thing that distinguishes them from each other is the subscript, right? The X for P represents that it is the price of good X, versus the Y that represents that it is the price of good Y. Those are completely separate variables, right? So you can have an X variable, a Y variable, a Z variable, whatever. Those are three separate variables. You can represent those variables with anything. So here, because we're working within the demand context, we're representing them with P's. But to denote the fact that they're separate prices, we subscript them to do that. So just keep track of that, or else you get lost and then it just becomes gibberish. We'll let M represent income. We'll let H represent the value of any other variable that affects demand, like advertising, like how much is spent on advertising, let's say. Then the demand function for good X may be written in a general form as this relationship here. So quantity demanded of X equals is a function, that's what the F represents, is a function of these variables. These variables affect quantity demanded. So this is how you start to model relationships in economics and any discipline that models relationships and uses variables and uses math and ultimately tries to predict things, forecast how things are going to work. You start by just saying there is a relationship. We don't know what it looks like. We don't know if the variables affect the independent variables affect the dependent variable positively, negatively. We don't know if they affect them linearly, like with a line with a constant slope, or if it's a curve with a changing slope. We don't know any of that. We just know that these variables are related, and these are the ones that we should be looking at. And we know that quantity demanded of good X is a function of these other variables. These other variables affect the quantity demanded of good X. So that's what this notation represents. Now, different products will have different demand functions of different forms. So different markets will have that relationship look a little differently mathematically. But one very simple but useful form is the linear representation of the demand function. So this is the linear representation of the demand function. So here's our dependent variable, quantity demanded of good X, it equals some constant. So the constant is represented by this alpha. Alpha is a Greek letter. Whenever you're representing mathematical relationships between variables and there's something else affecting it, like there's a constant in this relationship and then there's these slope parameters, then those are going to be represented by something other than a standard English letter, right? So in this case, we're representing it with Greek letters, which is a pretty standard approach. Again, don't ever be intimidated by notation. Notation is just a way to help us sort of distinguish between the things we're talking about when we're talking about them in general terms. And if you're not sort of focused on it, it can become intimidating because then you just look at it and you're like, I've never seen this before. This is crazy. Like, I have to figure out what this is. This is too much. So you just kind of have to just, like, when you see something like this and you don't necessarily understand what it is, like, go, like, find the information that tells you what it is. Don't just kind of sit there and just say, well, I don't get it. I'm done with this. I'm not even going to learn it. Figure it out. Anyway, so again, we're talking about the relationship between these variables as a linear relationship in general terms. Alpha subscript 0 is the constant. So again, the alphas are fixed numbers that the firm's research department or an economic consultant typically provides to the manager. So via quantitative demand analysis, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, we could do an analysis of a market looking at the relationship between the actual values that these variables take in relation to the actual amount of quantity demanded. And then using our statistical software, we can actually figure out what is this number here? What is the constant? What is the slope parameter for price? So let's say a change in price of $1 will affect quantity demanded by how much? Well, that's what this represents. This tells us that a change in the price of good X will change quantity demanded by however many units. That's something that you figure out statistically. So by the law of demand, an increase in the price of X leads to a decrease in the quantity demanded of good X. So because we understand that part of this relationship, we know that alpha X will be negative. So that means that alpha X will be less than 0. So at the very least, we know that. We don't know what alpha X looks like until we actually look at this relationship in a particular market. But in general, because we know the law of demand, we know that alpha X will be negative. The sign of alpha Y, so the marginal effect of the price of a related good on the quantity demanded of good X is going to be dependent on the relationship between the goods, so whether they're substitutes or complements, right? So the sign of alpha Y will be positive if X and Y are substitutes, right? So if good Y, let's say we're talking about peanut butter and jelly. So X is peanut butter and Y is jelly. If the price of jelly goes up, I'm sorry, we're talking about substitutes. So let's talk about the sugar substitutes, right? So quantity demanded of, let's say, Splenda in relation to, what were the other ones? Equal, whatever. Okay, I don't use that stuff. So anyway, so Splenda in relation to equal. So let's say the price of equal goes up. That means the quantity demanded of Splenda is going to go because people are going to substitute away from equal to Splenda, right? So therefore, this will be positive, right? Versus this one, which will be negative. So let's say you do a statistical analysis because you're trying to figure out if your market views your goods as substitutes or complements, then you can do a statistical analysis, and then the sign of this that you get from your analysis will tell you if the goods are considered to be substitutes or complements. So you can look at it, you can approach it from different perspectives where either you already know what the relationship is and you just need that specific number, or you just don't know what consumers think of the two goods in terms of like their relationship to each other in general for the market you're interested in, and you can get that from a statistical analysis. So again, if this is positive, the goods are going to be substitutes. The sign will be negative of alpha Y if X and Y are complements. So again, peanut butter and jelly. We're talking about quantity demanded of peanut butter. If the price of jelly goes up, the quantity demanded of peanut butter will generally go down in the US. And so therefore, alpha Y will be negative in that case. So alpha Y, again, the sign of it will depend on the relationship of the goods. Income also will have differing signs in its slope parameter, its marginal impact parameter. You can describe that in different ways. So again, if the good is a normal good, so that means if the income goes up, the quantity demanded of the good will go up. Then alpha m will have a positive sign, and if the good is an inferior good, then alpha m will have a negative sign, right? As income goes up, people buy less of it, so that will be captured in the relationship via the statistical analysis. And then H, of course, it will depend on what H is. If we're talking about advertising, then if it's effective advertising, it'll go up. If it's not, it'll go down. But we won't get into specifics about that. I won't necessarily need you to understand what will happen with H. It's just there to represent the fact that there are other variables that could be affecting quantity demanded. But you should definitely know this. Understand how to, if you have different signs there, what they mean in relation to those variables' impact on quantity demanded. All right, so the information summarized in a demand function can be used to graph a demand curve. But again, as I said, when you have a lot of variables, more than three really, it's pretty much difficult, in fact impossible to represent them geometrically. Since a demand curve is a relation between price and quantity, again, demand curve, a representative demand curve holds everything but price constant. So using this sample demand function, let's say you have, you've had your statistical department do some analysis, and you've actually figured out what those parameters are, what those alphas are, right? So here, this represents the law of demand. What kind of good is Y in relation to X? To substitute, right? As the price of good Y goes up, let's say by $1, then the quantity demanded of good X goes up by 4 units, is what that tells us. Is this a normal or an inferior good?
Inferior.
It's inferior, right? If income goes up by $1, the quantity demanded of the good goes down by 1 unit. That's what that's telling us. And then advertising, obviously, if advertising goes up by $1, let's say, quantity demanded goes up by 2 units is what that is telling us. Yeah. Is possible, yeah. So plugging in the price of Y, so again, we're going to hold everything else constant in order to just focus on that relationship between quantity demanded and price. So let's say we plug in price of Y equals 15, so that's going to be 60 there. Income is 10,000, so minus 10,000. And H equals 2,000, so plus 4,000 there. So that's, and then you do the math there by adding and subtracting these numbers to 12,000. You're going to wind up with this demand function, which just relates quantity demanded to its price, quantity demanded of good X to its price. And this relationship is what you normally see in a standard demand curve, the relationship between the price of the good and the quantity demanded of the good. Yeah?
So 12,000 is just the price of the good?
No, that's just a constant for the linear equation. So, you know,
Does it represent the price? Because in the formula it says the price.
the price of the good is here, price of X.
So what's the 12,000?
So it's just a constant. It's like the amount of quantity demanded that is independent of these other variables. Like if you just take these other variables out, the quantity demanded of good X would still be 12,000. So if you plug in the values of these other variables as we got here, then you can derive our simple relation between quantity demanded and its price. So we graph this relation with the price of the good on the vertical axis, as I already mentioned, which is not generally the case when you think about a relationship between two variables. You have an independent variable, that's going to be on the y-axis, and you have the, that's going to be on the x-axis, and the dependent variable is going to be on the y-axis. But in the relationship we have here, price is the independent variable. It's the thing that's changing. It's the thing that's affecting our dependent variable, quantity of x. So then you might be wondering, why is it graphed? Is that what you're going to ask? Okay, what were you going to ask?
The QDX, PX, all those are going to remain exactly the same throughout the class, right? For the demand function, all those variables.
Yeah.
This one represents income. Those are all
Yes, yeah, we're going to be consistent with the notation. Yeah. Yeah, so just an important note that you need to be aware of when you're jumping from the graphs to the math is like economics started out a while ago when Alfred Marshall came up with the supply and demand model in the 19th century. We had yet to standardize this approach we take in math of putting the dependent variable on the y-axis and the independent variable on the x-axis. Like it hadn't become a convention yet, a standard thing that everybody does. And because of that, we wound up with the situation where price is on the y-axis, the independent variable is on the y-axis, and quantity is on the x-axis, whereas they should normally be flipped around. So it's just something to keep in mind. So therefore, when we're talking about the relationship we're actually seeing graphed, we distinguish it from this mathematical relationship. We call it the inverse demand function. To get it, we just need to solve for the price of x in terms of the quantity. So we need to actually get quantity as the independent variable in just the way we're looking at the equation. So you're just going to do a little bit of algebra there, right? So here we're going to add 3px to both sides to get it on the left side, and then I'm going to subtract q dx from both sides. Right? So these cancel out, and then you wind up with 3px equals 660 minus q dx. And then you want to isolate your p variable, so you divide the whole thing by 3. And then that gets you to 2020 minus 1/3 q dx. So this equation here is what we call the inverse demand function, and that is what you actually see graphed, and that is what you've always been seeing graphed when we've been talking about demand curves in econ courses throughout your life. So it's just something to keep in mind. It's, again, a complexity of us, again, moving through time and just kind of having to adapt our current methods to older ideas. Yes? So that variable could be anything, right? We've been thinking about it as advertising. So that means an extra dollar spent in advertising leads to 2 extra units of quantity demanded of good X. Other questions? So as you see, feel free to ask questions as we're moving along anytime. I'm happy to answer them. All right, let's talk about this concept of consumer surplus, which is very important to our analysis of markets. So consumer surplus sort of tells us how well a market is operating. So, if you go back before we had like these big markets where everybody could sell and buy at, if you're looking for a particular good, you had to maybe just go and find like the one person that's selling that good, or in your area or whatever. And because of that, you're generally going to have to pay, no matter what you're willing to pay, you're going to have to wind up paying that versus like some market price, some equilibrium market price that is just sort of what all markets have equilibrated to, that allow you to say, well, even though I'm willing to pay $5 for the good, I only have to pay $3 because, basically as a society, as an economy, we've decided this one good is worth $3, right? So our demand curve represents the willingness to pay of all consumers, right? So these consumers over here are willing to pay high amounts of money. Their quantity demanded it does exist under those prices. And as we lower the price, more and more people are willing to buy the good. But people down here aren't willing to buy the good at high prices, right? So the price that anybody's willing to pay for any particular good is called their reservation price. And again, markets establish some kind of equilibrium price, some price that the good will sell for. It's called the market clearing price. We'll talk more about the forces that yield that in the next class. You've already covered it at some point. But anyway, so the difference between what a person's willing to pay and what they have to pay is their individual consumer surplus. And if you add that across all consumers in a market, then you get to the consumer surplus of the market. So again, we now show how a manager can use the demand curve to ascertain the value a consumer or groups of consumers receives from a product. The concepts developed in this section are particularly useful in marketing and other disciplines that emphasize strategies such as value pricing and price discrimination. So understanding how much consumer surplus there is in a market can actually help you to get some of that consumer surplus, but you have to be operating in the kind of market where you can do that. These are issues we'll talk about later in the course. But just, again, we're introducing the concept of consumer surplus generally right now. So consumer surplus is the value consumers get from a good but do not have to pay for, right? So let's say the equilibrium price is $3 for this good. All these people are willing to pay more, so each one is willing to pay more than $3. Each one has an individual consumer surplus. If we add them all together, then this triangle, bounded by the demand curve and the equilibrium price, is the consumer surplus. And if you get the area of the triangle, you can actually get the value of the entire consumer surplus in the market. So the total value to a consumer is their consumer surplus, the excess amount of value they gain from the good that they don't have to pay for, and the actual amount that they have to pay for the good, right? The price times the quantity, their expenditure. So if we add the two together, we get the total consumer value. Again, these are the expenditures. Two people are willing to buy this good at $3, so 2 times 3 is 6. So the area of this triangle, the area of this rectangle is 6, which is $6, which is the amount of expenditures, the amount that consumers spend on the good. It's also the revenue that the firm gets. So revenue is equal to expenditure. Just revenue is the amount that's spent from the perspective of the firm. Expenditure is the amount that's spent from the perspective of the consumer. So again, the sum of the expenditure and the consumer surplus is the total consumer value. So this triangle, again, is the consumer surplus. So more generally, consumer surplus is the area above the price paid for a good but below the demand curve. So let's do a quick demonstration problem. A typical consumer's demand to be able to calculate the consumer surplus. So a typical consumer's demand for the Happy Beverage Company's product looks like that in the figure. So it's the same figure we've been looking at. At the market price of $3, how much revenue will the firm earn and how much consumer surplus will the typical consumer enjoy? So again, revenue is expenditure, so I already told you what that is going to look like. So revenue is price times quantity. So the price is $3. We know that folks are willing to buy 2 units at $3, so the revenue is $6, which is equal to expenditure, as I added there. All right, the shape of the consumer surplus with a linear demand curve is a triangle. So you need to go back to your 8th grade body and figure out what was the equation for a triangle, right? 1/2 the base times the height, in case you remembered, in case you forgot. So 1/2 the base times the height will get you the area of the triangle. All right, so what is the base of this triangle? 2 units, right? What is the height? 2, right? The difference between this highest point and the lowest edge of the triangle, which is, again, represented by the equilibrium price, the price being charged in this market. So the height is 5 minus 3. The base is the amount that's being sold, which is 2 units. So 2 times 2, 4, and then 1/2 times that. So area of a triangle equals half the base, the height. So 1/2, I just represented as 0.5 there. The base is equal to 2, and the height is equal to what's called the choke price. The price at which quantity demanded is equal to 0. Also just the y-intercept of our demand curve. So there's a lot of ways to describe things. And try not to get confused. Just try to you can just stick to one of them, or just understand that different words mean the same thing. Obviously, that's just the nature of the English language. So our choke price is $5. Our market price is $3. So that gets us the height. So we've got our consumer surplus equals 0.5 times 2 times 5 minus 3, or 0.5 times 4, which equals $2. So the consumer surplus is $2. The revenue is $6. So what is the total value? $8. 2 plus 6. What is the most a consumer would be willing to pay for a bottle containing exactly 2 liters of the firm's beverage? So that's what the total consumer value represents. It represents how much a consumer is willing to pay for the total amount of the goods. And this is and this insight is used to price goods that are bundled, that are sold in packages, right? You can measure consumer surplus, look at the expenditure at any given quantity, and then add those together to figure out, well, what can you charge for, a bundled amount of these goods? It's the approach that's taken. Obviously, it's a little bit more complicated in practice because, the demand is a little bit more complicated than this generally. It's going to have a slight curve to it, so the calculation is a little different than just your standard triangle and rectangle, but this is the basis for that approach. This class is a lot about giving you intuition about how these things are done. And then, ultimately, if you do wind up in a position where you need to understand these things, you'll take more time to actually figure out what's actually being done. So what's the most a consumer would be willing to pay for a bottle containing exactly 2 liters of the firm's beverage? Well, the total value of 2 liters of the firm's beverage to a typical consumer is the sum of the expenditure and the consumer surplus. So the total consumer value is equal to $8. This is also the maximum amount a consumer would be willing to pay for a bottle containing exactly 2 liters of the firm's beverage. Expressed differently, if the firm sold the product in 2-liter bottles rather than in smaller units, it could sell each bottle for $8 to extract all consumer surplus. All right, let's jump to the other side of the market and talk about that, and then we'll call it a day. So the second half of the forces that determine the price in a market is, of course, market supply. In a competitive market, there are many producers, each producing a similar product. Again, we're dealing with a competitive market here. Versus a market that has imperfect competition, where a small amount of firms dominate, or the good that's being sold can be differentiated from your competitor. So, like a McDonald's will sell a Big Mac, Burger King will sell a Whopper. It's the same thing. It's a hamburger, but they've been able to brand them as something slightly different from each other, and in effect, kind of creating their own market, which then creates a little bit less competition because they kind of create the idea in consumers' mind that their good is not the same as their opponent's goods. So those markets are different than these markets. A monopoly is different than these markets because there's only one seller. So again, we're talking about a very specific type of market, a competitive market in which there are many producers and each sell a very similar product. The willingness of producers, sellers to supply is represented by our market supply curve, a curve indicating the total quantity of a good that all producers in a competitive market would produce at each price, holding input prices, technology, and other variables affecting supply constant. So again, we're just looking at the relationship between the quantity supplied, the amount that producers are willing to supply at any given price, and it's going to reflect their costs. We'll talk about how to derive this curve later on in the semester, and we talk about the behavior of individual firms and how they make their supply decisions. So again, there's a distinction between a shift of the curve and a movement along the curve. So a change in quantity supplied is the way to describe changes in the price of a good that lead to a change in the quantity supplied of that good. Again, this corresponds to a movement along the supply curve. So again, if price is the thing that's changing and affecting supply, then we're talking about a change in quantity supplied. We're just moving along this curve that represents the relationship between price and quantity supplied. And this is, of course, in contrast to movements of the curve. So the fact that the market supply curve slopes upward reflects the law of supply. As the price of a good rises, other things remain constant. The quantity supplied of the good rises and vice versa. So changes in supply, changes in variables other than the price of a good, such as input prices or technological advances, lead to changes in supply. This corresponds to a shift of the entire supply curve. So let's say it became cheaper for producers to buy oil, which maybe is used to power their machinery in their gene producing factory. So because it's cheaper for them to produce the genes at any given price, they're willing to supply more. So then that's represented by an increase in supply versus a decrease in supply. Let's say wages of workers go up because the minimum wage has gone up. At any given price, producers are going to want to supply less. So let's talk about the main shifters again. There's obviously more than what we're going to talk about here. but these are the main ones that we tend to focus on because they are the ones that are most relevant. So as I already mentioned, costs of your inputs into production. Your inputs into production are either going to be labor, your workers, or everything else that you use to produce, which is like your factory and your raw materials and the machines that you use to produce, the fuel you need to run those machines. So the supply curve reveals how much producers are willing to produce at alternative prices. As production costs change, the willingness of producers to produce output at a given price changes, which will increase supply or decrease supply. Technology or government regulations. So changes that make it possible to produce a given output at a lower cost have the effect of increasing supply. So we've seen huge revolutions occur over the last 150 years. The last industrial revolution is the digital revolution that happened over the last 30 years. That means that the speed at which we could communicate, the speed at which we could process, our ability to automate production has increased significantly. That means that our costs per unit of time have decreased to produce. And therefore, that's increased the supply in most markets. Government regulations. So, if the government comes in and says, well, you can only buy a certain amount of goods, then that will affect your price, and you'll be supplying less of that. Let's say they come in and say, you have a patent on what you're selling versus everybody else. Then obviously that will increase your supply because that will decrease your competition and you can then sell more. Natural disasters that destroy existing technology and government regulations such as emission standards that have an adverse effect on business shift the supply curve to the left. The number of firms in the industry obviously will shift the supply relationship, the relationship between price and quantity supplied. So at any given time, if more firms enter the industry at any given price, supply will increase. So, with like smartphones, when you only had a couple, supply was what it was. And then as Samsung and Apple and whoever else entered the market, at any given price, supply increased, supply shifted to the right. So as additional firms enter an industry, more and more output is available at each given price, reflected by a rightward shift in the supply curve. Substitutes in production are another one of the main shifters of supply. So many firms have technologies that are readily adaptable to several different products. Automakers can convert a truck assembly plant into a car assembly plant by altering their production facilities. When the price of cars rise, these firms can convert some of their truck assembly lines to car assembly lines and increase the quantity of cars supplied. So at any given price, they supply more because, again, they are able to substitute their production lines for the good that's selling higher. There's also complements in production. So like oil and natural gas, or like heating oil. So just raw oil that's used to be converted to gasoline, and then like heating oil. They can be pumped out of the same well. And so if the price of gasoline goes up and you want to produce more gas, you're going to wind up producing more of what you need to produce heating oil as well. So you're going to produce more of that as well. So again, there can be substitutes or complements in production. And that will affect the curve. It will either shift it to the left or the right, depending on the effect. And of course, taxes. Taxes will also affect the position of the supply curve. And excise tax, as I mentioned, is a tax on each unit of output sold, where the tax revenue is collected from the supplier. So suppose the government levies a tax of, let's say, 20 cents per gallon on gasoline. Since each supplier must now pay the government 20 cents per gallon for each gallon of gasoline sold, each must receive an additional 20 cents per gallon to be willing to supply the same quantity of gasoline as before the tax. So an excise tax shifts the supply curve up by the amount of the tax. So this is the initial supply curve. The government came in and said, well, we're going to give you an excise tax, 20 cents per unit of gas. So at this quantity before, the firm was willing to charge only $1, but now they have to add that 20 cents. And that happens at every single price. So effectively, a tax, an excise tax, will shift the supply curve to the left or up, however you want to describe it. It's the same thing. Note that at any given price, producers are willing to sell less gasoline after the tax than before. So that's another way of looking at it. At $1, they were willing to supply this much, and now at $1, they're willing to supply significantly less. So thus, an excise tax has the effect of decreasing the supply of a good. Another form of tax often used by a government agency is, like I mentioned earlier, an ad valorem tax. Ad valorem is Latin for based on the value. So it literally means according to the value. And ad valorem tax is a percentage tax. The sales tax is a well-known example. So in the figure, the curve represents the supply for backpacks before the introduction of, let's say, a 20% ad valorem tax. So initially, at $10, 1,100 were willing to be supplied. At $20, 2,450 were willing to be supplied. Once the 20% tax is implemented, the price suppliers will collect for each unit goes up by 20% at any output level. So at 1,100, the price will go up by 20%, so that's $2. To supply 1,100, they will need to charge $12. But at $24.50, they would only supply before at $20. 20% of $20 is $4. So now they need $24 to supply that $24.50. So an ad valorem tax will actually rotate the curve counterclockwise, and the new curve will shift farther away from the original curve as the price increases, which is why you see an increasing distance between the two. It still is characterized as a decrease in supply, but obviously it's not exactly one for one as it is in a standard case. Yeah.
What about taxes that are meant to put on people? For example, the gas tax, 76 and Chevron and all these other gas companies. Does that affect their supply curve at all?
That will affect the demand curve. If the tax is being placed on consumers, that will affect the demand curve. We didn't talk about that here, but it does. And finally, of course, expectations. Like I mentioned, play a huge role in economics in general, definitely in markets. If firms expect prices to go up next year, they will tend to lower their supply today. If firms expect prices to go up down next year, they'll supply more today. So producer expectations about future prices will also affect the position of the supply curve. If firms suddenly expect, I've already said this. All right. Let's cut it off there. We'll jump into the supply function on Thursday. So, I'm not going to do anything else as far as assignments or anything. So have a good couple of days, and I'll see you on Thursday. Again, if you're trying to get into the class, make sure you sign in.